second chair leaders. Welcome back to the Second Chair Leadership Podcast. Today, we're diving into a topic that's rarely ever addressed directly, but can erode the foundation of your church, my church, leadership, and that's disloyalty. So we're going to break that down. We're going to break down each layer of disloyalty today, exploring how it begins in small ways and grows into something that can sabotage the mission of your church. This episode isn't just about identifying the issue. It's about equipping you with practical steps to root it all out before it really ever begins. Whether you're struggling with loyalty yourself, which all of us do, or see it on your team, by the end of this episode, my hope is you'll have the tools you need to address it head on. So let's dig in and start where disloyalty begins. And it starts with unmet expectations. Let's start with the foundational layer of disloyalty. It's unmet expectations. This often is where disloyalty begins, and it's really subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly under the surface, often undetected. Think about Absalom in the Bible. Absalom, he felt entitled to a specific level of recognition and respect from his father, King David, but those expectations weren't met, and over time, they turned into resentment, and eventually, it led to betrayal. This is what I know about disloyalty. It often starts this way, with expectations we didn't realize we had, or assumptions about our role that went unfulfilled. Now, let's be real right now, okay? How many of you have ever felt overlooked or underappreciated? Me, I have. Maybe you've been working hard, giving everything you have to the church, but you just feel unseen. We've all been there. You know, you're putting in the hours, you're handling responsibilities, but no one really seems to notice. And that quiet disappointment that you have, right? It starts to build. You know, if it's left unchecked, that feeling can grow into bitterness, which is the breeding ground for disloyalty. You know, the challenge with unmet expectations is that they're often unspoken. They're like invisible weights that we carry. But as leaders, we need to be aware of when those quiet frustrations are creeping in, because unmet expectations, when left to fester, when left to grow, inevitably lead to resentment. So how do we prevent unmet expectations from growing into disloyalty? Well, I think we need to create an environment where expectations are not just assumed, but they're communicated and they're also clarified. So here are what I would say are some practical strategies to help all of us address the feelings head on. Practical tip number one, right? It's just establish clear expectations. From the start, make sure everyone on your team knows their role and what's expected of them. We have to have intentional conversations, intentional discussions around roles, around the goals, and often the timeline, so that there's no room for assumption or even misunderstanding. And tip number two would be create feedback loops. Regular check-ins aren't just another meeting. They are an opportunity for your team members to feel seen and also valued. So questions like, hey, what's one thing you need from me to feel supported? That's a great question we ask, right? It allows for open dialogue and can prevent small frustrations from turning into bigger issues. And here's an example, right? You use one-on-one meetings to ask team members, hey, are there any expectations in your role that need adjusting? What this does is it gives your team members a chance to communicate areas of frustration, and it also clarifies the goals. It builds trust and transparency in the team. Let's move on to the next layer, which is passive disloyalty. This type of disloyalty is subtle and often goes unnoticed because it's just quiet. It's the kind of disloyalty where someone still shows up, but they're emotionally checked out. They're there in their body, but not in spirit. They're giving the bare minimum, they're avoiding active engagement, and they're no longer invested in the mission. Passive disloyalty can be so stinking dangerous because it's easy to mistake it for burnout or even shyness. But make no mistake here, guys. Passive disloyalty slowly eats away at team unity. Think about it this way. If your team is a body, Passive disloyalty is like an undetected infection in your team. It may not show outward symptoms right away, but if left untreated, it can spread and weaken the entire body and weaken the entire team. So if you sense this kind of quiet disengagement, please don't ignore it. Passive disloyalty is a signal for you that something's off. And I believe it's our job as leaders to address it before it grows and become something crazy. The last thing you want is for disengagement to quietly set in and gradually chip away at your team's morale and unity. When we see passive disloyalty starting, it's time to step in and re-engage. Here's how we can reconnect those team members to the mission and purpose of their role. Here's practical tip number 1. And it's simple. Just encourage active participation. Don't let people sit on the sidelines. In meetings, call on the quieter team members by asking questions like, hey, what's one thing you're excited about this week? Just simple questions to get them engaged. What this does is it helps everyone stay engaged and feel valued. And practical tip number 2, I want you to set personal accountability goals. Work with every team member that you have to set individual goals that directly tie into the mission. When someone has a specific purpose, they're more likely to stay committed and actively and engaged. Here's an example. Start each meeting, every meeting you do, with a one-word check-in where each team member describes how they're feeling about their role. If someone reports feeling disconnected or unmotivated multiple times, it's a cue. It's a red flag to reach out and re-engage them. I want us to dive into what I would consider the third layer here, and it's comparison. This is where disloyalty starts to pick up a little speed here. Comparison is deadly in a team because it creates division. When you start thinking things like this, I could do this so much better. I could preach better. You're not just doubting your leader, you're undermining the unity of your team. This is where resentment begins to build, and it's one of the quickest paths to active disloyalty. Think about Lucifer's story that we read about in Isaiah. He didn't start out as the enemy. He started out as a trusted angel, but comparison and envy, what it do? It took root, and he believed he deserved more. That mindset ultimately led him to rebel. Comparison doesn't just affect the person doing the comparing. It has a ripple effect that impacts the entire team. And the problem with comparison is that it's subtle. You may not even realize you're doing it until you start to notice feelings of jealousy, notice feelings of entitlement, and maybe even those emotions of frustration. Comparison can quickly turn into disloyalty, right? If we're not intentional about managing, we've seen it happen before. And here's how we can prevent comparison from undermining unity on our team. I want to give you 2 practical tips. 1, create growth opportunities. If leaders feel overlooked, I want you to provide them with clear growth paths within your church. It's simple. Development opportunities can show your team that they're valued and have room for advancement. And a tip number 2 would be recognize unique strengths. Take time to celebrate each team member's unique contributions and skills. When people feel seen for who they are, they're less likely to fall into the trap of comparison. I want you to start meetings with a strengths round where each team member highlights something they appreciate about another's skills. This helps create a culture of appreciation, reducing the need to even compare one to another. Now, we've talked about passive disloyalty, but let's talk about active disloyalty. When disloyalty moves from thought to action, this includes things like gossip, backhanded comments, and subtle undermining. Proverbs 18:8 describes gossip as a choice morsel. It's tempting, but it's ultimately destructive. Gossip isn't just harmless venting. Every comment chips away your team's unity and mission. Active disloyalty might seem small, but it's one of the most damaging actions we take as leaders. When you roll your eyes or make that sarcastic remark to your coworker or to your leader, you're actively undermining the leader and the vision. These small, seemingly insignificant actions, they erode trust and destroy team morale. If we're serious about rooting out disloyalty, we have to address gossip and undermining behavior head on. Here's a few ways that we can create a culture where loyalty and respect are prioritized. Practical tip number 1 would be set boundaries against gossip. Make it very clear that frustration should be handled respectfully and directly. Establishing boundaries against gossip reinforces trust and integrity within your team. And practical tip number 2 would be model vertical communication. Handle your frustrations with maturity. Handle your frustrations with respect. When you lead by example, others are more likely to follow suit. And here's some steps just to avoid gossip altogether. Vertical venting. Encourage your team members to bring frustrations directly to God or the appropriate person instead of venting to your peers. Accountability partnerships. I want you to pair up your team members to help each other commit to constructive communication, which builds trust and builds unity. And finally, my second chair leaders, let's talk about the ultimate consequence of unchecked disloyalty. It's division. Division in the church isn't just inconvenient, it's destructive to the mission itself. Division starts as a small crack, one comment here, a passive act there. But if it's left alone, it will grow and ultimately break apart the unity of your team and your church. Jesus himself warned us about this in Matthew 12:25. Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. Here's the thing, leaders. Division in church leadership doesn't happen overnight. It's the accumulation of unmet expectations, the passive disengagement, comparison, it's gossip and undermining. It's a slow, steady chipping away at the unity you've worked so hard to build. Division is the tipping point. It's the stage where everything that's been hidden beneath the surface comes out and wrecks the foundation. So how in the world do we prevent disloyalty from reaching this level? How do we keep the team united even in challenging season? Let's get into a few practical steps you can implement right now. Practical tip number 1, I want you to do team unity check-ins. I want you to take time during meetings to ask, hey, guys, are we all aligned with our mission? Because unity check-ins can keep everyone on the same page, especially during periods of transition or a lot of stress, which most of us are there right now. Tip number 2, conflict resolution training. Come on, equip your team with tools to resolve conflict in constructive ways. Many conflicts escalate because people don't know how to communicate respectfully. Training in conflict resolution can prevent disagreements from turning into division. Tip number 3, establishing a shared vision. Consistently remind your team of the overarching mission and vision of your church. Shared goals and a common purpose are essential to keeping the team unified and focused on a greater cause beyond personal interests or grievances. At the start of each month, bring your team together for a unity huddle. Use this time to review the mission and pray together for alignment and harmony. This will reinforce that the mission is bigger than anyone individually, and it keeps everyone focused on what's important. All right, second chair leaders, that wraps up our deep dive into the layers of disloyalty. We've talked about unmet expectations, passive disengagement, comparison. We've talked about gossip, and finally we talked about division, the tipping point where disloyalty ultimately sabotages the mission. If there's one takeaway from today's episode is this: loyalty isn't a nice to have, it's a must. Disloyalty may start small, but left unchecked, it can wreak havoc on your team and ultimately on the church's mission. So here's my challenge to you. Take a hard look at where disloyalty might be hiding in your own heart. Are there areas where you've left frustration, comparison, or resentment take root? I want you to address it now before it grows. And if you see any of these layers in your team, it's time to have those tough conversations to realign and restore unity. Second chair leaders, let's keep this conversation going today. If you can, go over to my Instagram, hit me up, DM me at Walker Tyler Official. Let's talk about your experiences in leadership, how you've dealt with loyalty in leadership. Let's talk about how we can support each other in building teams that are unified, that are loyal, and that are committed to the mission. Hey, and also do me a favor, share this episode with a friend who needs to hear it today, and let's build a community of strong, loyal leaders ready to impact the world. And remember, guys, second chair doesn't mean second best. Keep leading with integrity. keep pushing forward, and stay aligned to the mission. Until next time, stay strong, leaders.